SEP FanFic Readings presents My True Love Gave to Me by Notebook and Ink. Chapter 3. A Partridge in a Pear Tree. December 2001. Draco was never one to do anything half-arsed. He said he was going to take his place as head of the household, so he was all in. Every morning he woke up early and had a quick fly before popping into a steaming shower to wash away the sticky sweat. Standing before the gilded mirror in nothing but a fluffy gray towel, he'd flick his wand a few times. His cropped hair would be dried and styled, and one of his many fine, expertly tailored suits would fly out of his suit rack in the corner. After brushing his teeth and shaving if needed, Draco would head into the closet and pick out his cufflinks, tie pin, and watch for the day. After dressing, he stopped in his study to have a look at his day planner to see if any new meetings or events had appeared. If they had, he would send out any needed correspondence before slipping the small planner into the pocket of his jacket. In the breakfast room, Tippy would have a variety of morning papers laid out for him next to his place setting, and he would scan them while he picked through his meal. In the beginning of the new year, Draco had worked mostly out of Malfoy Manor. His mother had done a fair job of trying to get their financial affairs in order, but she'd never known the full, true extent of their family's holdings. With his father in prison, it was up to Draco to figure out the complete listing of what they had before, and what had been used up in the war or seized by the ministry in the aftermath, and what that left them with for the future. Almost all of the inherited fortune had remained, but quite a bit of investment money had been lost, and a few properties liquidated. The Malfoys were Voldemort's personal golden geese, after all. His father had all but handed the psychopath their Gringotts vault key, and the ministry wasn't kind either. In the spring, Draco had decided to purchase the old apothecary, Mr. Mulpepper's, in Diagon Alley. The building was run down, the store was lacking inventory, and the old witch was eager to sell after her husband had died. She just couldn't keep up on her own anymore, and had no real interest in trying. Since potions had always been a passion of his, and it was good for him to have a project, he jumped at the opportunity. It didn't hurt to have the wizarding world see a Malfoy do some good in public, well-visited area either. By the end of summer, renovations were finally finished. The downstairs held the back storeroom, which used to be an office they'd expanded, a fair-sized brewing room, and the large open shopping area up front. Upstairs, which used to be the old owner's apartment, Draco had gutted out and turned into one large office. He lined the opposing long walls with bookshelves in which he housed any and all books he could transfer over from the family library, as well as his own. He'd also instructed Blaze to keep an eye out for any interesting volumes about the subject while he traveled and send them his way. As soon as he'd found a brilliant potioneer, as well as a shop clerk, the building was back open for business. Now this was where Draco spent his days. In the evenings he went to any and all charity or society events his mother asked him to attend, as well as any outings she had set up with prospective bride's family. Most dates ended abysmally, as the girls were just not what he was looking for, or fit what his mother had stated would be her expectations for the next Malfoy matriarch. After a few had gone well, Draco had decided to move himself to the family's townhouse in Mayfair. Just the thought of bringing a woman back to the manor for possible romantic interactions while his mother was in the building turned his stomach. Even though it was large, it would never be large enough for that to be okay in his mind. The move was also encouraged by the fact that Draco's interest in the Muggle world, much to his mother's dismay, was only growing. So by autumn, his schedule remained mostly the same, all except he had to exchange the morning fly for a run. He now ate breakfast alone, and he would often have lunch in Muggle London if he didn't have a meeting. On nights he didn't have any other obligations, he might grab dinner at the Muggle restaurant, or see a show or a movie. On weekends, he dreaded going back to Wiltshire. As he had predicted she would, Pansy went behind his back and convinced his mother to let her help with the Christmas party planning. She was there every time he went home, and the two women had been pestering him with questions for months. If he'd known he was going to be subjected to this brand of torture, he would have never told them they had to work within a budget. It had mostly been a joke on his part, because he wanted to see if they could even do it. The two witches did not fit anyone's definition of frugal, and in truth they'd blown past it a while ago, yet any time they asked, he told them they were getting dangerously close to the mark. "Do you think that would be feasible?" pulling him from his thoughts on his little jape. Draco, Narcissa, and Pansy were eating at the dining room table. He was stationed at the head, the positioning having now become routine, while his mother was on his right and Pansy on his left. "I don't know, Pansy." He hid his small smirk by taking a drink of his wine. "You're so close to going over already. Are you sure you really need all the birds?
Come on, Draco. You won't budge an inch. The party is weeks away. My bird guy needs to know, like yesterday.
You have a bird guy, he deflected.
Yes, I have a bird guy. She looked at him with annoyance. And if we want to really hit hard on our theme, then I need to give him a final confirmation.
They'd gone with classic Christmas. Everything was to be red and green, with soft white lighting and more bows, garland, and decorated trees than he could have imagined the manor could hold. Under Pansy's instruction, they had also planned to extend things beyond the foyer and the ballroom. A total of 10 rooms were to be sequestered this year, each one filled with the items from the 12 Days of Christmas song, and a host of waiters holding trays of signature hors d'oeuvres and drinks inspired by that room's items. Their guests were going to be completely pissed by the end of the evening, but at least most of them would be able to handle it, since Pansy had also been adding almost every witch and wizard born in the last 100 years to the guest list. I will tell you what I have been telling you, Pansy, he replied calmly. You do what you think is best. He loved watching her squirm when he said that. He knew that she was conflicted with doing just whatever she wanted, and being respectful of the fact that she wasn't the one paying for any of it. She'd kill him when she found out there really was no budget. On Friday afternoon, Draco took lunch at his favorite cafe in Muggle London, the one just up the block from the music shop he frequented, although that was less often now that his therapy sessions had dwindled down to occasional check-ins, and since he owned so many CDs that he could almost start a shop of his own. He sat in one of the booths with a high wooden back that was next to the largest window. It had the best vantage point for Muggle watching, both in the cafe and out. His Discman sat unused on the table next to his coffee cup, as he had become engrossed in watching a young couple argue on the bus stop bench outside. Then there was a hard pinch on his left arm. "Ow!" he shouted, then whipped his head around to see Granger smiling down at him. Her hair was pulled back into some kind of twisty bun thing, so she had no knit hat this time around, but she did wear the rest of her familiar Muggle attire. He was surprised to see her, given what Theo had told him about her career change. "Where in the hell did you learn to do that?" It was like her fingers had gone through his clothes and straight to his nerves. She laughed lightly. "Ginny taught me a long time ago. Help me keep the boys in line." He hadn't even noticed how much he enjoyed the sound of her laugh, until he realized how long it had been since he'd heard it. "Well, it's pretty obvious it's me this time." He shoved a hand through his hair. "I know," she smirked. The waitress returned to the table with his order and placed it in front of him, a simple turkey club and chips. "You stayin'?" she addressed the brown-haired witch, her heavy Irish accent coming through. "Oh, Granger looked at him, and he could practically hear the cogs turning in her brain, overthinking every situation that might occur if she did or didn't sit down. He tried to keep his expression as neutral as possible. He himself wasn't quite sure if he wanted her to stay or go either. "Sure," she said, then slipped into the bench seat across from him, and Draco was suddenly very aware of his posture as he straightened up even further. "What'll you have, then?" the waitress asked in bored tone. Granger took off her coat. She eyed his plate. "What he's having looks good. Thanks." The waitress scribbled on her notepad, then turned on her heel to head back to the kitchen. The pair just stared at each other for a long minute. Draco was the first to break the heavy silence. "Forgive me if this seems obvious, but it just seems odd to me. You seem almost happy to see me." He reached for his cup of coffee. "I suppose I am happy to see you," she replied with a small smile. "Why?" He quirked a brow before taking a sip. "Because it means you weren't lying last year when you said you were interested in learning about Muggles. It means you really have changed." She had a fair point. Seeing the person who would continually call her a mudblood to her face out in a Muggle world must have been quite a shock last year. "Is that why you're here?" "In London? Or this cafe specifically?" Granger brought her hands together in front of her on the table and started fidgeting. "Both, I guess," he replied. He was curious to hear the answer for each. "Well, I always try to come back and visit my family for Christmas," she started. "As for the cafe, you said it was a good place. Plus, I kind of wanted to see if you really were telling the truth about enjoying time around Muggles. It was a long shot, but I thought I might run into you here." She shrugged her shoulders, as if seeking him out on purpose was no big deal. He enjoyed the thought of her doing so. "How was it you put it last year?" and tapped his chin with his long index finger.
Oh, yes. Wow. Hermione Granger, Malfoy lover. Never thought in my lifetime I would have thought I'd see that. Granger rolled her eyes and huffed a laugh. That's quite the stretch. I have not yet spent nearly enough time with you to love you. Just give it a minute. It comes naturally to most, he replied. Draco smiled and faded when he remembered their past, but he still couldn't take his eyes off hers. But seriously, I really thought you'd hate me forever. Especially after I tried to apologize. The waitress came back with another plate of food, and Draco finally dropped his gaze. Granger thanked her, then turned her attention back to him. I've thought a lot about that day, actually, she admitted. I probably should have done something more than just stomp off in silence. Like hex me into oblivion, he said. No, she said quickly. Throughout 8th year, I could see that you were trying to change. I wasn't ready for it when you came up to me with that day. I was trying to reconcile the pompous arse you used to be with who it seems you were trying to become, and how that could have happened. Draco winced at the memories of himself as a selfish, spoiled child, then a lost, drowning teenager. A lot happened during the war. Things I shouldn't have let happen. Things I'm not proud I had to witness or be a part of. I can understand that now. It was harder back then because I'm still processing my own issues. Granger took a long breath. But, if you'll let me, she fixed her soft brown eyes on his steel gray ones, I'd like to accept your apology now. Draco's heart skipped a beat. He never thought he would hear those words from her. But there they were, coming from her own mouth uncoerced. Thank you, he replied simply, and she gave him another small smile. Both of them began eating, and Draco expected to continue on in silence until they were finished and she would leave. But instead, she initiated conversation between bites. Clearly, Granger had never been forced to take extensive classes on table manners as he had. So, you seem different. Even since just last year, she said. What do you mean? He stopped eating and raised a blonde brow. She narrowed her eyes like she was trying to put her observations of him into words, but was coming up short. I mean, you've always looked put together, but this is different. You look more grown up, authoritative. It's intimidating. Well, I took over as head of my family. It's a lot to manage, and a lot of expectations. It was time to grow up. Oh, was all she said as her head nodded slowly. She was now, no doubt, thinking about how much he probably resembled his father, stern and unforgiving. Perhaps she was even regretting sitting down to lunch with him. But what about you? He deflected, no longer wanting to talk about himself. What about me? You've always had bollocks, Granger, but now you're confident, fearless. Not everyone would break things off with their partner and quit their stable job to live across the globe and work with wild creatures. I'm not the only one who was intimidating. He could see some color rise in her cheeks as she tried to tuck away an invisible loose strand of hair. He fought off the smile it brought to his lips. Conversation between them flowed easier than he would have expected it to. They asked questions about each other's jobs. Then they moved on to how many newts each other had taken and their score received. They talked about books, music, and when she learned that Draco had been going to the occasional movie, she gave him a list of the ones she thought he'd like, and even some she knew he probably wouldn't, but said they were necessary watches nonetheless. By the time Draco looked down at his watch, they had been sitting there chatting for nearly 2 hours, long past his lunch break. Not that he had anyone to report back to or admonish him for it. What time is it? Granger asked, having noticed him looking at the time. Almost 2:30, he responded. Oh, shoot. I should get going. I'm supposed to be at my parents' house in an hour, and it's a bit of a drive. She gathered up her coat and started looking for the waitress, who had never brought any bills. Don't worry about the check. I'll take care of it, he smiled. You sure? I'm sure. There were only a few hours into the party, but Draco was already having a much better time than last year. After the grand entrance with his mother, who made sure to thank Pansy for all her hard work and her speech, Draco perused every single one of the 10 party rooms. He noticed that all of his mother's guests from previous years were present, as well as most of the newcomers Pansy had invited. His friends had even managed to come out from hiding in his study this year. While Draco wasn't a huge fan of large crowds, all his anxiety about it seemed to melt away when he saw how his mother beamed at the apparent success of the evening.
She glowed in her velvety emerald green dress. He was happy all her hard work was paying off. The ballroom, since it was the biggest, had been chosen to host 2 sets instead of 1. Of course, it had to have a multitude of silencing charms put on it to keep the arrangements coming from the 12 drummers and the 11 pipers from seeping out into the rest of the party. The lords leaping and the ladies dancing were also put in one room, and guests were encouraged to dance along with them to jaunty Christmas songs. It reminded him of the public ball scene in the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, when everyone is bobbing in 2 lines and jovially dancing around each other. The rest of the rooms were mostly filled with birds, except for the one in which there was some sort of golden ring-toss gambling game that had been set up. Draco had been worried that the animals might turn on the guests, but she had assured him that the bird guy had promised that they either were trained or charmed to behave throughout the entire evening. He did note that she said nothing about the livestock in the milking room, his least favorite of the rooms. That honor went to the last one, the partridge in the pear tree. Scattered around the room were crates of pears, and in the very center of the dimly lit room stood an enormous pear tree in full bloom. It was covered in delicate white flowers, with fairy lights twisting around its trunk and branches, and on a low-lying branch sat a solitary brownish-looking bird. It was beautiful to behold. This room also had the benefit of having hardly anyone else in it, and he could take a break from smiling at every young witch who seemed to be looking his way lately. When he entered, he grabbed a flute of pear cider from the waiter and just slowly roamed around the tree, taking in the sweet scent. The fruity yet floral smell reminded him of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He thought about it for some time, until he was interrupted by familiar voices coming down the hall.
"Evening, Potter," he greeted them with a simple nod as Harry and Ginevra strode into the room.
"Malfoy," Harry replied with a nod of his own.
"Thank you for accepting the invitation. I know that probably wasn't an easy decision."
"Ginny really wanted to come." Potter looked at his new bride with a smile. "Plus, your mother put her neck on the line for me at the Battle of Hogwarts. I figured I should at least try to return the favor, though I don't know if I'll ever come close."
"I know she appreciates you being here."
"I've always heard the Malfoy parties were grand," Ginevra piped up, "but this is beyond what I was expecting. I thought it would just be dinner and drinks. Not all this." She gestured into the room.
"It used to be before the war. They really outdid themselves. I can't even imagine what they'll plan for next year, but knowing Pansy and my mother, they've already started." He huffed a laugh.
Potter laughed and Ginevra smiled. Maybe it was just the drinks flowing through everyone's systems, but Draco figured now was as good a time as any.
"Potter," he started, "I wanted to apologize."